I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the Executive Director of the American Historical Association. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to what our panelists have to say this morning about the history of these alliances in different parts of the world and why that history is essential to thinking about their current and future role in our nation's global presence. Many historians who work in various corners of our lives are fond of talking about the relevance of history. The AHA never talks about the relevance of history because relevance is too low a bar. History, you don't study history because it's relevant. You study history because it's imperative, because it's valuable, it's necessary. So we consider relevant to be way too low a bar. Our congressional briefings, in that spirit, provide congressional staff, journalists, and others in the policy community with historical background necessary, not relevant, necessary to understand the context of current legislative concerns. This program rests on a rather simple premise. Everything has a history, including issues that are either on the congressional agenda or occasionally should be on that calendar. Careful historical contextualization of issues relating to the work of the Congress, your work, is not only possible, it is essential. Our second premise is that it's possible to provide that historical context in a manner that is nonpartisan and unencumbered with a particular legislative agenda. Our speakers will adhere to that standard. And I should say we have had historians adhere to that standard whom none of their colleagues ever believed they could possibly adhere to that standard. But everybody has done it, just so you all know. The background summaries that you picked up on your way in make it clear that the specialties of our scholars don't cover all parts of the world, and the summary doesn't cover all parts of the world. But when we get to our Q&A, please, and I haven't warned our panelists about this, please feel free to ask questions about any place or any time. Our panelists have their specialties, but they are also broadly knowledgeable in this arena. You have index cards on which we invite you to scrawl questions as you listen, and they will be picked up by AHA staff members, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. That will be the responsibility of today's moderator, Dr. Dane Kennedy, Professor of History Emeritus at George Washington University, and far more knowledgeable about today's topic than I am. That's why I'm going to disappear and let him do this. His bio and those of our speakers are in the handout. Before I hand over things to Dane, one quick reminder as you're listening. Again, everything does have a history, and if you and your colleagues are wrestling with a challenging issue and need historical context, please let us know. The AHA has nearly 11,000 members. We can find a historian to speak on any topic. We are well aware that you have access to the Congressional Research Service. For various reasons that some people in the audience know, I am not going to start getting into competition with CRS, but we can provide you with people like this on any topic that you want. We cannot provide it in 24 hours, which I know CRS can do. Dane?
They made a card for me, so I'll put it here so you know who I am. Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. The fundamental premises that underlie American foreign policy and especially the military alliances that are foundational to those relations are arguably less stable and secure today than they've been for the last 75 years. One has to go back to the years immediately prior to the entry of America into the Second World War, when isolationist sentiment was at its height, to find a similar period of contention about our country's role in the world. Many critics, including one of the two major presidential candidates, no longer accept the premise that Madeleine Albright made, and which was part of a broad bipartisan consensus for a very long time, that America was the indispensable nation essential to the maintenance of the international order. So given the fact that this premise and these issues are more up for debate today than they have been in a very long time, the AHA thought this was a really good time to remind us of the circumstances that gave rise to the country's current military alliances. Fortunately, we have three experts with us who are superbly qualified to provide this historical context. You have the biographies of them in the handout. I'm not going to read them in detail, but they do deserve an introduction. I will introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. First of all, Jeremi Suri, who's professor of history at University of Texas, Austin, and the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs. He's the author and editor of 11 books. I'm not going to read them all, but a few of them include...
Just buy them, please.
There we are. Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. The Impossible Presidency, the Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office. Liberty's Surest Guardian, American Nation Building from the Founders to Obama, and I could go on. He also writes for the New York Times and various other media outlets. Second speaker will be my colleague, Gregg Brazinsky. He's professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University. His books include Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, and the Making of Democracy, and Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War. He's director of the Asian Studies program at the Elliott School of George Washington University. Thirdly, Renata Keller is associate professor of history at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her first book, Mexico's Cold War, Cuba, the United States, and the Legacy of the Mexican Revolution, won multiple awards, and she's currently finishing a hemispheric history of the Cuban Missile Crisis titled Nuclear Reactions, the Cuban Missile Crisis and Cold War in Latin America. So each of them will speak in turn for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open things up for questions. As Jim said, there are these index cards. Feel free to start writing questions. You can start writing questions right now. You don't even have to wait until they speak, but as soon as their formal remarks are over, we'll collect them, and I will ask the speakers the questions, okay? Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. I want to thank the AHA and my friend Jim Grossman, the executive director, for organizing this, Dane Kennedy, and my colleagues, including a former student, Renata Keller, who's now a distinguished professor. It's really it's an honor for me to be here with you. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk about U.S. military alliances with all of you. I'm going to focus on NATO in particular, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but I want to start with a little historical background. It's very important to know that until World War II, the United States shunned military alliances. And part of the discomfort that we sometimes hear in our politics with military alliances today comes out of that history. There's a very legitimate and long history of American isolationism, as we all know, and American anti-alliance thinking. It is, of course, George Washington who warns us against entangling alliances in the late 18th century. From the time of the Revolution, when the United States did have an alliance with France, through World War II, the United States did not join a single military alliance. This is always a good question to trip up students on, because the students think in World War I we were part of the alliance. Woodrow Wilson refused, actually, to join the Western alliance. We were an associated power, not an allied power as such. This changed during World War II. And it changed for two very specific reasons. Franklin Roosevelt was absolutely clear about this. In fact, he used this history of non-alliance American diplomacy to justify shifting policy for a shifting world. His argument was that if the United States was going to be the arsenal of democracy, that meant that the United States would want to provide the supplies to help other countries to defend our interests, but we did not want to always be the ones doing it ourselves. Or in Roosevelt's terms, the United States was better served when our friends were helping us to do the work that served our interest, rather than our doing it ourselves with only our boys. We wouldn't use that gendered description today, but that's what he was basically arguing. That was the justification for the grand alliance, the military alliance the United States had, which included, of course, Great Britain, but even more importantly, the Soviet Union. And this still astonishes my students when I point out to them that Joseph Stalin was actually an American ally, and that was not because Franklin Roosevelt had somehow gone soft on communism. It was because he recognized that through Lend-Lease and various other forms of alliance management and legislation, the United States could provide aid to the Soviet Union, which we did, military and civilian aid, which would allow the Soviet Union to fight the German army and the Japanese army late in the war and take the burden off of us. And as we all know, that is actually the secret to how the United States won the war, particularly in Europe. The Soviet Union lost upwards of 30 million citizens. The United States lost less than 500,000, right? Pretty good trade-off if you think of it in those terms. American military alliances for Roosevelt during World War II and in his planning for the post-war world were to serve two interests above all. One, U.S. security. Roosevelt made it clear that the United States could no longer, these are his words, no longer assume that we could stay shuttered in our corner of the globe without problems in other areas affecting us. And he meant economic as well as political, having lived through the Great Depression. And second, he argued that the United States had an interest in a world order, that's what he called it, a world order that would provide a safe home for the four freedoms, which is his famous description in January of 1941 of what the United States stood for. This is before we've even entered the war, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, freedom from want. Norman Rockwell, of course, makes this famous in his wonderful paintings of this. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the alliance that most directly grew out of that legacy. And in fact, it was not an American president who decided that NATO should exist. It was, in fact, the British, as well as other European allies. Ernest Bevin, who, by the way, was a Labor foreign secretary, he was from the Labor Party, this is the government of Clement Attlee, in 1948, was concerned that the United States would leave Europe and that the United States would not provide Europeans with, in addition to the Marshall Plan aid, the military aid they needed to defend, in Bevin's terms, Western civilization from the scourge of communism. Bevin, as an old labor leader, a dock worker in Britain, had actually come to the conclusion that communism was the greatest threat to what he saw as a labor, social welfare government. Dane can speak to this much more in detail than I can. And for him, the United States was crucial in protecting a peaceful and democratic Europe. NATO was therefore created out of European requests for American help, and it was built around the notion that Europeans would help themselves, but we would help them too, and we would help them because it was in our interest. And I want to make this clear. There is nothing soft-headed, nothing idealistic in the creation of NATO. It is a hard-headed alliance designed to serve American interests, British interests, French interests, German, and others. It is a reaction to the Soviet Union. It is also an effort to integrate Germany into Europe. Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, gives us the money quote for what NATO is really about. Here it is. He said in 1951, NATO is designed to keep the Soviets out, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. To keep the Soviets out, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. And as NATO goes into its first real phase of existence in the 1950s and 60s and 1970s, NATO is doing just that. It is within the NATO structure that we see the development of the Germany we see today. Initially, the Federal Republic of West Germany. In 1955, West Germany, with American support, creates a military, again, the Bundeswehr, which is now one of the main components of NATO's land forces in Europe. The Bundeswehr was created within the umbrella of NATO so it could provide a contribution for conventional support in Europe, as well as engineering and technical support, but it had to be within NATO because of the history of German militaries. And that worked so well, by the way, that at the end of the Cold War, this was a crucial requirement that Gorbachev had. There's a lot of debate, and legitimate debate, over whether NATO expanded too fast, too quickly at the end of the Cold War, but I will tell you there was never a moment when Mikhail Gorbachev thought it would be a good idea for a new Germany, a reunited Germany, not to be part of NATO. That was actually not the debate. NATO was a way of integrating Germany. The story of the European Union, the story of European integration, is in many ways an outgrowth of NATO's unification of a Western alliance. Now, it's important to make the point that NATO always operated with American military command. It still does. The first sacker of NATO was actually General Dwight David Eisenhower. He left Columbia University, where he was a president and not happy being president. There's a long string of that being the case. Presidents of Columbia who then leave to do something else. He was the first sacker, and to this day, military command of NATO is under American command. It's an integrated military force under American military leadership. But political leadership in NATO is shared. There's a Secretary General, and there's a North Atlantic Council, which makes consensual decisions based on unanimity. So this is not an alliance where the United States tells all the members what to do. And those who watched the expansion of NATO into Finland and Sweden in recent months saw this. Right? Turkey, in essence, had a veto because they're part of the North Atlantic Council. It's a unique alliance where you have clear hierarchical military command, but you have shared political leadership among the members. And the deal was always that the United States would provide a disproportionate amount of the military force. We would provide more of the muscle, particularly the nuclear umbrella, and that the allies would, on the ground, do a lot of the political work, as well as making military and economic contributions. But it is important in debates now, when we talk about what proportion people should pay, it was always assumed at American request that this would be an American military-led alliance, which meant the United States would have to burden more of the military requirements. That was our desire. And there are many reasons, if you talk to anyone who has been involved with NATO military affairs, why that's the case. Article 5 in NATO requires all members to come to the defense of others when they're attacked. This has been invoked only one time, as many of you know, on what's today the anniversary of the 9/11 attack on the United States. But NATO has been involved in many operations within Europe and outside of Europe, including the bombing of Belgrade during the Yugoslav War and NATO activities in Afghanistan. Overall, the alliance has had many internal squabbles. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Charles de Gaulle in 1966 insisted on France having more autonomy and actually kicked NATO military headquarters out of France for a while. It has never been an alliance where all these allies have just agreed on everything. But it has been an alliance where they have managed to work together for common defense, and a common defense that has served American military interests, American strategic interests, American economic interests. What are the takeaways from this relatively short history? There's obviously more to talk about, but I want to get to some of the takeaways. First, it's hard to come up with an alliance that's been more successful in history. And it seems that whatever the United States has paid, I think every historian would tell you the United States has gotten more value than the dollars it's put in to this alliance. If you think about the development of Europe, the integration of Europe, if you think about the ways in which the transatlantic economy operates, if you think about American security, it's hard to find anything we spent money on that worked better for our interests. Certainly better than the wars we fought when we were not working with this alliance, right? The war in Vietnam was largely opposed by our NATO allies. The war in Iraq was largely opposed by our NATO allies. And I would tell you it didn't work out very well in either case. But the cases where we have worked with our NATO allies, multiple Berlin crises, for example, the alliance has actually been a major help to American strategic interests. It is a consensual alliance. A fellow historian from Norway, Geir Lundestad, called NATO an empire by invitation. And I think that's fair. It is an empire. The United States does have disproportionate influence. That's why we pay a disproportionate amount for it. But it is an alliance that works because the members of the alliance generally want to be in the alliance and they feel they have some say. It's a model for other alliances. I'm sure my colleagues will talk about this in more detail. One of the problems with American alliances elsewhere, particularly in Latin America, has been that they have not been consensual alliances. It has required perpetual work for alliance management. And I really want to hammer this point. I'm sure there are a few friends from state here. One of the great successes of American diplomacy, one of the important roles American diplomats play, is building and maintaining relationships with our NATO allies. These relationships matter because there will always be differences. And the way to manage these differences is to manage those relationships. It's absolutely crucial that we have diplomats, as we've had, who are well trained in what we would call area studies, the history and languages of our various allies in Europe. It has been one of our strengths, and actually, I will tell you, NATO has motivated the training of people like that on our campuses too. So it's been a very symbiotic relationship in that way. NATO has always reflected a disproportionate U.S. contribution. It can't exist without it. It seems to me it's ahistorical to say that one day we'll wake up and every member of NATO will pay the same amount for the United States to have disproportionate military influence. I don't see how that would ever work, aside from the fact that the economies are so disproportionate in size. And I would say it's hard to imagine a stable Europe going forward, especially in light of the war in Ukraine, without NATO. I will just close with this. Last summer of 2023, I spent time, actually, I was lecturing at NATO headquarters, and I spent time in Europe, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and elsewhere. Not only is there great appreciation for NATO, that doesn't mean they agree with everything the U.S. does. Those are two different things. Not only is there great appreciation for NATO, these countries, these longtime allies that had lived in the Soviet shadow, their essential point of security and stability for their democratic governments that are struggling against far-right movements is the belief that NATO provides some security guarantee against Russia. It is not the presidential election that makes them feel that way. It is not the rhetoric that comes from American citizens. It is the belief in this history of NATO. I heard that time and again from various political leaders, whether it was the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic who we talked to, the Foreign Minister from Poland. Fundamentally, NATO is essential to the stability of their democracies because it gives them reason to believe they can resist Russian efforts to undermine their democracies. That takes us back to Ernest Bevin. That's exactly what he was arguing in 1948-49 when he led the European demands for the creation of this alliance. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks to James Grossman and the AHA and Dane Kennedy for inviting me to this event. I've been given the task, is this on? Yes. I've been given the task of talking about the history of America's alliances in Asia in about 15 minutes. So obviously there's a lot to discuss. I can't do everything, but I'm going to really focus on three things. First of all, the pivotal importance of the Korean War in the formation of America's alliances in Asia historically. Second, the structure of America's alliances in East Asia and how that came into being. And third, the impact of détente and U.S.-China relations in the 70s and afterwards on America's alliances in Asia. So I actually, as I was preparing this, I sent some notes to James Grossman, and I wrote in the notes, like, no alliances in Asia before the Korean War. And James was like, do you mean no U.S. alliances or actually no alliances? And I was like, oh, no, you're right, no U.S. alliances. But actually, if you think about it, there aren't really that many military alliances in Asia before World War II either, or before the Korean War either, at least not of the kind of state-to-state military alliances that we commonly think of. But if you look at the U.S. and East Asia at the time that the Korean War broke out in 1950, there's no alliances of any kind. Japan is still under American occupation, but there's no treaty. The U.S. had played a heavy role in creating South Korea as a separate state. It had given it a lot of aid, but Dean Acheson had left it outside of the American defense perimeter in his famous speech. And there is absolutely no U.S. commitment to Taiwan or the Republic of China, which Acheson and Truman believed would eventually be taken over by the Chinese Communist Party, much as the rest of the Chinese mainland was. So during the Korean War, though, the U.S. attitude towards its Asian partners or other, towards countries in East Asia that it was cooperating with, all of a sudden changes. First, in Japan, the Korean War convinces the United States of two things. First, that the United States needed to end the occupation of Japan as quickly as possible in order to prevent resentment of the United States as an occupying power. And second, that the American position in Japan was a strategic necessity. So these are the two things that start to, that American policymakers start to think about Japan. There is a mutual security treaty which is signed in 1951 between the United States and Japan as the Korean War is still ongoing, the same day as the Treaty of San Francisco. And this arrangement basically leads to Japan's subordination to the United States militarily and strategically. And what does Japan get out of this? The ability to focus on butter instead of guns, on its civilian economy. Then in terms of Taiwan, one of the first actions that the Truman administration takes after North Korea launches its invasion of South Korea in June of 1950 is, of course, the dispatch of the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait and the declaration that Taiwan will be considered neutral territory. There's no mutual security treaty with Taiwan until 1954. This actually occurs right at the time that the Chinese have been shelling these two islands that lie between Taiwan and the mainland, Jinmen and Maze, but eventually they get a security treaty as well, and it would not have happened without the Korean War. And of course, the U.S. ROK alliance is often called an alliance forged in blood, and indeed it was. During the war, the South Korean forces were placed under the UN command, and the U.S. does everything that you would do with an ally during the Korean War. It helps to build up the South Korean military. It gives millions of dollars in military aid and economic aid, though it's not until after the war that the United States actually signs a mutual security agreement with Seoul. Finally, I'm not going to talk as much about our other alliances in Asia, but it's worth noting that it's during the Korean War that you not only get the mutual security treaties with Japan and that leads to these new commitments to Korea and Taiwan, but it's also during the Korean War that there is a treaty signed with the Philippines. ANZUS is signed in October of 1951, and the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which would eventually become defunct, but that was also created during the Korean War. Now, what is the structure of America's alliances in Asia? It's actually a very different structure than the one that exists in Europe. The United States in Asia has had a system of multiple bilateral alliances rather than the kind of multilateral alliance structure that exists in Europe. Why has this been the case? Victor Cha, who teaches at a university in town which will go unnamed but is vastly inferior to GW and the Elliott School, has argued that after the Korean War, the United States was worried that South Korea would try to invade North Korea and that Taiwan would try to resume the civil war with China. And so it created this bilateral alliance structure both to protect these American allies but also to restrain them, because it didn't want South Korea to restart the Korean War, even though Syngman Rhee was often threatening that he would. But I think if you look at new documents that have come out since Victor published his work, there's been a lot of new materials that have come out from the Asian countries about this issues. And if you look at these documents, it makes it clear that divisions and disagreements among the East Asian leaders were just as important, if not more important, than what the United States wanted to do. There was all kinds of mutual animosities between Seoul, Tokyo, and Taipei during the time. Syngman Rhee refused any kind of multilateralism that included Japan. Syngman Rhee was, of course, the first president of South Korea. He had spent most of his life in the United States protesting Japanese colonialism. Chiang Kai-shek was also very frustrated with Rhee and Rhee's manipulative tactics. After one meeting, Chiang Kai-shek wrote in his diary that he found Rhee to be outrageous, cunning, rude, and unrighteous. So there's a lot of frictions and animosities between these leaders. But despite the fact that you have this different system, I do think that this arrangement of multiple bilateral treaties has proven to be a very durable one in a lot of ways. They survived the AMPO treaty protests, a massive protest against the renewal of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty in 1960. They've survived multiple changes in government in South Korea, and they survived through the 1970s multiple crises across the Taiwan Strait. Now, there was a significant change to the U.S. alliances and the way they functioned to some degree, I would say, during the 1970s, and a lot of this becomes as a result of Sino-American rapprochement and the so-called Nixon shocks, which to East Asians and to Japan and South Korea especially meant not only taking the U.S. off of the gold standard, which adversely affected East Asian exports, but also the act of visiting Beijing, Nixon suddenly making an announcement that he was going to visit Beijing without really consulting any American allies beforehand. There were multiple responses to U.S. changing relations with China during the 1970s. First, South Korea and Japan say, well, if the United States is going to improve its relations with China, then we're also going to improve our relations with China. And so they start to do this. Japan is actually more successful at it initially than South Korea, but even South Korea starts to improve its economic relations with China at a time that it knows that it can't improve its political relations, and because China has an alliance with North Korea. The South Korea, though, at the time also began an effort to improve its relations with North Korea and to develop an autonomous defense capacity. And a lot of the heavy industry development in South Korea that occurred during the 1970s was deeply interconnected with these efforts to develop an autonomous defense capacity. The shift, though, was most difficult for the Republic of China, or Taiwan, because it leads to the United States' eventual normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979, the cancellation of the U.S. Republic of China Mutual Security Treaty, and the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act. And this act basically states that the United States was not going to make a security guarantee to the Republic of China, but it would quote, make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. But nonetheless, despite the wording, to Taipei at the time, this seemed like complete abandonment. Nonetheless, I think since the 1970s, and in particular since the end of the Cold War, America's alliances with Japan and South Korea and its relationship with Taiwan have continued to evolve beyond the initial emphasis on containing communism. Now, the countries work against nuclear proliferation, to protect the environment, to promote scientific and technological development, and to promote other common objectives as well. There's still issues that remain. How will, for instance, the Quad, which is often talked about in security, in discussions about Asian security today, how will this reconfigure the U.S. alliances in Asia? What would South Korea's role be in the Quad? And what should the cost-sharing burden be? These are the kinds of issues that continue, that remain to be discussed and talked about. But overall, I would say there's a few important points to take away. I think the U.S. alliances and partnerships in East Asia have survived and thrived for a number of reasons. First, especially since the 1980s, they have been based on a set of common shared democratic values outside of the Western Hemisphere. The number of liberal democracies is actually very, very few. Second, there has been flexibility. The U.S. has accommodated the growing demands of South Korea and Japan for greater autonomy and respected their economic growth and desire for independence. Finally, I think today, even though there's not quite a multilateral alliance structure, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan face a number of similar issues where they can collaborate, even in the absence of multilateralism, such as low birth rates, environmental issues, supply chain issues, and global public health. So I will end there. Thank you all very much.
You can all see me over the podium. This might help. Thanks. Hi, thank you all so much for coming today. I'd also like to begin by thanking Jim Grossman and Alex Levy and Ben Rosenbaum for inviting me. Move this way down. For inviting me here to speak with you. Since we're talking about military alliances, I also want to acknowledge our men and women in uniform and thank them for their service, particularly the two of them who volunteered to review earlier drafts of my comments. So thank you to all of you. So I focus on U.S.-Latin American relations. When I was invited to speak with you, I thought, military alliances in Latin America. Okay, I can think of two pretty good examples, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But when we're thinking about formal military alliances, things that are codified in mutual defense treaties, there actually aren't that many examples in Latin America. Again, formal treaties, things that are codified, things that have oversight. In Latin America, in contrast to what we just heard about in East Asia, they've tended to be multilateral, so more similar to NATO. But they are relatively less common than what I'm going to focus on today, which I'm calling informal alliances. And these have been much more frequent in Latin American history. So when I say informal alliances, I'm talking about things that don't quite meet that bar. They aren't codified in treaties. They might be security agreements. They might be military coordination. Arms sales are a big one for Latin America. But they aren't quite alliances per se. Even though we often refer to our allies, they aren't technically alliances. And so I'm calling these informal alliances. And there's a big spectrum of this type of activity and arrangement. In Latin America, these informal alliances, another characteristic is they tend to focus on internal security. So again, in contrast to NATO and East Asia, when it comes to hemispheric relations, the concern has been less about state-to-state warfare and more about things like internal subversion or drug trafficking, things like that. Another characteristic of these informal alliances is they tend to be less accountable because they're less formal, and that has been a big problem. And thanks to that, they've also been less effective. So that's my big argument for today, this contrast between formal and informal alliances. Just to give you a couple examples of the formal alliances, Jeremy spoke a little bit about World War II. Latin America, all of the countries eventually of Latin America joined the Allies in World War II, and they made a pretty significant contribution to the Allies' victory. They provided a lot of strategic resources. Brazil provided its strategic location. It's way out in the Atlantic Ocean. If you look at a map of Brazil, you can see why the northeast of Brazil in particular was very useful for the Allies in conducting the war in the Atlantic. And they even contributed men and women who went and fought in Europe, especially Mexico. A lot of Mexicans living in the United States, Mexican Americans, went and fought in Europe and the Pacific. Mexico sent the Aztec Eagles. I want to remember. Yes, the Aztec Eagles was a fighter squadron that fought in the Pacific. And Brazil contributed tens of thousands of people who fought in Europe. So Latin America made a very significant contribution to World War II through this formal military alliance, the Allies. Another example is the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, which is a mouthful, and so we call it the Rio Treaty or the Rio Pact after the city where it was signed. It was agreed to in 1947, so this is actually the United States' oldest multilateral treaty. It predates NATO by about a year and a half, and it really marked the beginning of really deep U.S. military and intelligence involvement around the world. So what the Rio Treaty is a hemispheric defense treaty. It declares that an armed attack by any state against an American state, meaning all of the Americas, shall be considered an attack against all the American states. So again, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us, we all defend each other. The next year, the countries of the Americas created the Organization of American States, or OAS, which was the organization in charge of invoking the Rio Treaty. Among its many responsibilities, one of them is invoking the Rio Treaty in case of attack. And this actually happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is why I know about it. So I would argue that the Rio Treaty served its greatest service to mankind during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So when John Kennedy announced the presence of missiles in Cuba, he called upon the Organization of American States to establish the quarantine. And the other members of the hemisphere had to choose whether they agreed that the missiles in Cuba were unacceptable. And all of the members of the Organization of American States voted unanimously to invoke the Rio Treaty. And so that made the quarantine a multilateral act of hemispheric defense instead of a unilateral act of war by the United States, which would have been much less well received upon the world stage, and things could have played out much differently if the countries of the Americas had not been unified in demanding the missiles be removed. So that's one example of how these multilateral treaties have been very effective in serving U.S. national security interests and in protecting lives across the Americas and around the world. But that's not really what I'm focusing on today. Instead, I'd like to talk more about informal alliances in the Americas. And I'm going to focus on Mexico as an example, as our closest neighbor, one of our most important allies. And I'm going to talk about two of the thorniest issues in U.S.-Mexican relations, immigration and the war on drugs. Both of these issues have roots in informal alliances and have been addressed using informal alliances in ways that have been very harmful to the United States and Latin America and Mexico. Okay, so we'll start with immigration, a very topical, it's been in the news a lot, maybe you heard. So the Mexican Revolution of 1910 was the first big 20th century wave of immigration from Mexico to the United States. There's been other waves during the Bracero program, which was a series of bilateral labor agreements between Mexico and the United States in the 1940s through 1960s. We also see a lot of immigration, but these two examples tend to be cyclical. People come, they work, they go back to Mexico. Things start to change after the Bracero program, and particularly in 1985 when President Ronald Reagan gave a speech signaling a major shift in which he described Mexican immigration as, quote, an invasion. And this idea of framing immigration as a threat to national security made it more of a military matter, right, instead of an economic or political issue. And so the United States government started treating immigration as an issue of national security and using unilateral U.S. military measures to, quote unquote, defend our borders. And so I'm talking about things like fences and walls, using drones, the forward deployment of National Guard members to the border, things like that. And they've been unilateral because the Mexican government has not been particularly interested in restricting the movement of its citizens to the United States. In contrast, the Mexican government has been much more willing to cooperate to reduce migration across its national territory to the United States and controlling the movements of people seeking to enter. In particular, the greatest number of these people are people from Central America seeking to cross Mexico and into the United States. And again, this migration pattern has roots in informal U.S. military alliances with Central American governmental and non-governmental armed forces. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. The first is Guatemala. In 1954, the U.S. military, the CIA, the State Department worked together with right-wing armed groups in Guatemala to overthrow a democratically elected leftist president. And this ushered in 36 years of civil war between Guatemala's military dictatorships and various armed groups, during which the Guatemalan military state committed massive human rights abuses, including massacres, genocides of indigenous Guatemalans, all kinds of crimes. Estimates of the number of deaths caused by the Guatemalan state reach about 200,000 in 36 years. During this time, the United States government ignored this. They had information about what was going on, and they continued to fund the Guatemalan military, provide training, logistical support, things like that. During the 1960s and 1970s, the United States provided about $30 million in military aid. This increased significantly in the 1980s when the United States provided hundreds of millions of dollars to the Guatemalan state while it was conducting this terror campaign against its own citizens. Similar things happened in Nicaragua and El Salvador. In Nicaragua, the United States was actually funding non-governmental military groups because there was a leftist government, Marxist government in power. So the United States was funding the Contras, the Contrarrevolucionarios. So that's another example of an informal military alliance because it wasn't even with an official military. But the violence and destruction of these civil wars pushed millions of Central Americans to flee north. And so you can see these informal alliances with Central American militaries and non-governmental militias were one of the key contributing factors of the immigration crisis. And that continues today. I know I've been talking about the 70s and 80s, but the aftermath of these civil wars continue to push Central Americans out of their homes and to seek better lives in the United States. Things like political instability, poverty, inequality, gang warfare, these all continue to threaten the well-being of Central Americans. And they make this dangerous journey across Mexico, but the United States has refused to accept all but a tiny percentage of the asylum seekers and displaced people, which has stranded hundreds of thousands of them in Mexico. The Mexican government does not have the resources to support them, so many of them are living on the streets or in tent camps. The United States has pressured the Mexican government to stop potential immigrants before they reach the U.S. border. And so in response, in cooperation with the U.S. military, the U.S. government, Mexican security forces, and Mexican military has started militarizing the migrant route. So they've started deporting people, arresting them, sending them back to insecure situations in their home countries. And this has also been funded by the United States, since, again, the Mexican government doesn't have the resources available. So the United States has provided more than $100 million in equipment and training to Mexican military forces for this effort, and especially to secure the Mexico's southern border region. But as enforcement has increased, so too have violent crimes against migrants. That has been an unfortunate side effect of this militarization. And so, again, I argue this informal alliance between Mexican and U.S. security forces to prevent people from migrating across Mexico into the United States has caused significant harm and hardship to an already very vulnerable population. The other example I'd like to give you is the war on drugs. The war on drugs, again, has also been fought largely through informal military alliances and with equally disastrous results both here in the United States and in Mexico. So Mexico has for a very long time been both a source and a transit point for drugs bound for the US market. And for most of the 20th century, the Mexican government, under its one-party rule, that the PRI and the police formed this kind of protection racket for the drug market. So they would take kickbacks, they would control the drug trade in exchange for cuts of the profits, and they provided stability and a relative amount of peace to the market. There wasn't much violence for most of the 20th century. This started changing in the 1990s and 2000s. As the PRI started to lose power, political instability set in, and drug traffickers started fighting each other to establish new political connections and control over territories. This violence escalated significantly in 2006 when Mexican President Felipe Calderon declared a war on drug trafficking. He essentially called in his military to do the job that the police had refused to do, again, because the police were very much involved in the drug trade. And the United States assisted Calderon's war on drug trafficking through something called the Mérida Initiative, which is not a formal alliance, although it is closer to on that formal end of the spectrum. And since 2008, the United States has funneled over $3.5 billion to Mexico to fight crime. But this militarized approach has been a complete failure. It's led to unprecedented levels of violence, and it's completely failed to stem the flood of drugs into the United States. So since 2006, when Calderon declared his war on drugs, again, fought with close U.S. military cooperation, Mexico has seen its murder rate more than double, resulting in 400,000 homicides and 90,000 disappearances. And while the violence has mostly stayed on the Mexican side of the border, the drugs have not. And so since 1999, with the start of the opioid epidemic, more than 700,000 Americans have died from drug overdoses. And many, though not all, many of these deaths are attributed to fentanyl produced in or smuggled through Mexico. And so the U.S.-Mexican drug partnership has failed to protect U.S. or Mexican lives. So just to conclude, to wrap up, the key takeaways that I want you to have are that, at least when it comes to U.S. and Latin America, formal alliances, similar to NATO, have successfully served hemispheric security interests, as they did in World War II and during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Informal military partnerships, meanwhile, have caused a great deal of damage, and we should never forget that, because that has been the predominant pattern in U.S.-Latin American relations. So if the history of military alliances between the United States and Latin America tells us one thing, it is that we must pick our battles and our allies very carefully. Thank you.
So I know we're running toward the end of the hour, but we can stay here. Those of you who need to leave, feel free to do so. But we can stay a while longer. If you have questions, fill them out on the index cards, and I will ask them. So looking forward to those, and I'm sure our commentators are as well. As these get collected, let me just raise a question for the panelists, and that has to do with when you think in the broad terms of America's position in the world since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War. Perhaps the biggest rupture point was the end of the Cold War, right? And yet, listening to all of your presentations, one of the things that struck me was that there are far more continuities in terms of American military alliances and relations with other countries in the world over the course of this period since the Second World War, then ruptures after the end of the Cold War. And I'm wondering if any of you, and I realize there are differences too, yeah? But if any of you would like to comment on that, or if this is an issue that you find relevant.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, that's mostly correct in terms of America's alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, other places as well. I think there's a variety of different factors behind this. Number one is, of course, in the Korean situation and applicable to Japan as well, is that the Cold War didn't really end on the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
So there's still, this perception on the South Korean part and on Japan's part as well that American military protection is necessary. But I also think even while there's been continuity, there's also been some change in the focus of these alliances so that they don't focus completely on containing communism anymore, even though, of course, with the reemergence of a second Cold War, which people have been talking about for the last, decade or so, there's been a renewed emphasis on the threat that can potentially come from the People's Republic of China. But I think in addition to that, there's been a number of other good reasons, such as I mentioned, cooperation on scientific and technological issues, cooperation on environmental issues, that have also been factors in maintaining these alliances and maintaining a U.S. military presence in East Asia. At times, the U.S. troop presence is unpopular, or I wouldn't say unpopular, but there's protests against it. But overall, public sentiment, at least in South Korea, which is where I spend the most time, is generally favorable to maintaining an ongoing U.S. presence there. So.
I would just add quickly that I think alliances, formal alliances, and I think Rennie's distinction between formal and informal is crucial. Formal alliances tend to be formed in the wake of a common threat, but over time they're built around common interests. And so even when the threat changes, that's the distinction certainly Cold War and post-Cold War, even as the threat changes, the interests are actually still there. That's one thing. And then the second thing, what makes a formal alliance so stabilizing, for better or for worse, is that then it develops a whole set of interest groups around it. And so alliances are very sticky for the United States, which is, of course, why Washington was skeptical of them. But that's why they've actually been a way of anchoring American stability and American interests in the world.
I'll just say that I completely agree about this idea of continuity. I focus on the Cold War, but now I'm moving in my research toward the war on drugs. And I see so much similarity in the idea that people are seeing their own population as the enemy. Yeah. And that is not something that lends itself well to formal military alliances. And so the idea of how we frame our battles dictates how we fight these wars, whether through formal or informal alliances, is something we should keep in mind even now as we're fighting wars on terror and drugs instead of wars against communists.
Okay. So here's a question that none of you are experts in, and yet relevant to the panel itself. So I'll throw it out. You can defer answers if you wish, but comment if you'd like. In light of what's currently happening in Gaza, would any of you be able to elaborate on U.S. military relations alliance with Israel?
I'll say a little bit about that, but I want to preface that by saying I'm not an expert on the U.S.-Israeli alliance, though I do get asked that question quite often. There are two myths about the U.S. military alliance with Israel. One is that the United States has always been enthusiastic about being a military supporter of Israel. That's not true. Actually, until the early 1970s, American military support for Israel was minimal, and in some ways was against the law until 1967. So that's a myth that we have to get over. The U.S.-Israel military alliance is a relatively recent phenomenon. And then the second thing I would say is the U.S. military alliance to Israel has always been built on the presumption of a two-state solution. That's there from the very beginning when Henry Kissinger is really negotiating what becomes that arrangement. It's during his shuttle diplomacy that Secretary Blinken has kind of redone in recent months. It seems like every day he's over there, right? It is built upon the notion that the United States would provide for Israel's defense against existential threats, which were real and probably still are real, but at the same time that there would be movement toward a two-state solution. That has been built into that alliance, so it is not radical for anyone to see that as part of the relationship today.
Okay, this is a question for Professor Brazinsky. Given the evolution of the security and political environment in Asia since the 1950s, is the time ripe for a serious reconsideration or discussion of a multilateral alliance among U.S. and at least a couple of the current bilateral allies? In other words, a shift from bilateral to multilateral.
Right. I think that's a good question. I would say a couple of things. One, some of the problems that existed with trying to bring together a multilateral alliance historically still exist to some degree. There's still occasional clashes between Japan and South Korea. And then, of course, when it comes to the Quad, there's also this perception of, there's also this perception that, the different countries involved in that have a different outlook on China and what is the nature of the Chinese threat. I think, South Korea is its economy is very dependent on its trade relations with the People's Republic of China. So it's very hesitant to alienate the PRC to a greater degree than, say, Japan or India or other countries in the region. That having been said, even while those problems exist, I still do believe in general that there are so many common problems if you look especially at Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, not only security threats, but environmental threats, public health issues, supply chain issues. They all have high suicide rates. They all are falling off a demographic cliff, right? They all have these common problems, and I do think there's not a multilateral alliance, I do think improved multilateralism among Asian democracies would be beneficial, not only for the United States, but for for our partners in East Asia themselves.
Okay. Jeremi, could you elaborate on the relationship between the security provided by NATO and the efforts of Eastern European leaders fighting anti-democratic challenges?
Yes, thank you for that question. I would love to say more about that. First of all, it has to be said that it's true in Western and Central Europe as well as in Eastern Europe now, there are major far-right movements. It didn't get a lot of play in the United States. There was actually a coup planned in West Germany. A West German prince had organized, in conjunction with certain AfD members, an effort to actually unseat the government. This should be more alarming to us. It's a small proportion of the population, but the fact that this exists is quite significant, and there has been even more of that in Eastern Europe. I will just mention a name that was in the news last night. I'm not making a political statement here at all. Viktor Orban, whose name came up. No one should invoke his name in any kind of positive context. This is a man who has been working closely with far-right movements and encouraging them throughout the region and using his veto within the European Union and NATO to sometimes get in the way of efforts to enforce the rule of law. So what NATO does for these governments that are fighting against right-wing movements is it does a number of things. First of all, it provides resources for their defense, which allows them then to focus on internal security. NATO is not involved in internal security. This is a difference from what we have in Latin America. And I would argue it's very important that we create guide rails and limits on the use of military alliance forces for internal issues. NATO does enforce that in the case of Eastern Europe, and it does, the value it's providing is allowing these governments that are short of resources to actually focus their resources on internal issues. That's number one. Number two, it provides them with a method, with intelligence, with technical assistance in combating external efforts to support right-wing movements in their society. And the key concern here is Russia. Estonia, Poland, Finland have all dealt with major cyber attacks that came out of Russia, just what we're dealing with here, what was just brought out in the news here at a much worse scale, much larger scale. NATO provides critical assistance in that area, as does the EU. That's vital in protecting their democracies. And then the third thing I would say, and what I take most seriously, many of these countries have people in them, citizens in them, who are concerned, angry about the economic situation, about various internal issues. This is true in Eastern Germany as well as in Poland and elsewhere. But they're still proud to be part of NATO. They want to be part of the West. And to this to them is a very important element of their politics. If we were to somehow say we were not committed to NATO, that would be coded as the United States not being committed to them. And that would be harmful to the moderate and left parties in those countries. So in all those areas, it's a major part of what I would call our democracy agenda as well as our security agenda.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up, but I'm sure the panelists will be happy to speak to you individually if you didn't get questions answered or you have other questions. And please join me in thanking them.